Hello, everyone.
And welcome to
Dad
and Me
Love History.
Dad and me love a whole lot of history. We could be the greatest team that the world has ever seen. Dad and me love a whole lot of history.
The idea for today's topic was posted on our social media by both Carleen Rowell and from Sarah, who runs a small company called Lovely Life.
Thank you, Carleen and Sarah. And the rest of you lazy butts could give us your ideas on
Instagram,
Twitter,
or Facebook, or via dadandmelovehistory.com. If you've not checked out our webpage, do so. You can listen to every episode straight from our webpage. You'll find all the questions, you'll find all the show notes, and you'll find images, pictures from that go alongside every episode. So dadandmelovehistory.com's worth a look. Anyway, today we are investigating a part of World War II that's not so well known. It's about
ordinary families who were kept prisoners all over the world.
Yes, and the word for that is internment. If you were interned, you were put in prison, but not because you were a soldier or in the Air Force or in the Navy, but as a civilian. So a civilian meaning people who are not in the armed forces.
Why did the picture go to jail?
I don't know. Why did the picture go to jail?
Because it was framed.
So, James, why do you think ordinary people, civilians, were interned or imprisoned?
Because, well, they might think they're spies.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. This fear that there would be spies already living in their own country who'd spy for the enemy. Both sides held ordinary civilians as prisoners during World War II. But we're probably going to focus mainly on some English-speaking countries, starting with the USA.
Yeah, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941, the USA declared war on Japan. President Roosevelt made all people with Japanese ancestors go into internment, sort of like a prison. In total, the USA, around 120,000 Japanese people were sent to these prison camps. There were 10 camps. Children were sent there with their families. People were split into 3 separate groups for which camp to go. There was
Issei, immigrants from Japan, and Nisei, people whose parents are Japanese. And finally, Sansei, that's people whose earlier ancestors, might be grandparents or great-grandparents, were Japanese. So we're really talking about Japanese Americans. Most of these people, most of the 120,000 Japanese Americans, were born in the USA and lived all of their lives in the USA, yet were considered to be enemies because their grandparents or great-grandparents or whatever were originally from Japan. Or because anti-Japanese feelings were strong at this time after the Japanese had attacked the Americans at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, killing more than a couple of thousand people. And there were suspicions that Japanese Americans might help Japan.
also 12,000 German and Italian people were sent into these camps in the USA because Nazi Germany and Italy were a part of the same side as Japan. This only ended in 1945 when World War II ended with the defeat of Japan and their allies. In 1988, survivors of the American camps got an apology from the USA as well as $20,000 American dollars each.
Yeah, 1988. So that's 43 years after World War II ended. These Japanese Americans got that apology and some financial compensation. Mind you, that's more than what other internees got. Just before we finish on the US, something few people today know about is that during World War II, the US government, with help from some governments in South America, also captured and imprisoned about 2,200 people with Japanese ancestors in Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia. Why are inmates so angry all the time?
I don't know.
Because they have bad cell service.
Oh my.
Now looking at internment in the UK during World War II. Britain had entered World War II before the USA, and so Britain interned people with roots in Germany, Austria and Italy in particular before America did. Most of these people had lived in Britain for all or most of their lives, and they were not supporters of Hitler. I mean, virtually all of them were not supporters of Hitler. Thousands of these internees, or civilian prisoners, were Jewish, and so were definitely against Hitler and the Nazis. And yet, in Britain, they were put in prison.
In May and June 1940, 30,000 Germans, Austrians and Italians were arrested and sent to temporary camps on an island called the Isle of Man.
Some of the internees were then deported from Britain. They were sent abroad to camps in Canada and Australia. What do you give prisoners for dessert?
I don't know. What do you give prisoners for dessert?
Jelly beans.
Oh my.
In Australia, more than 15,000 Japanese, German and Italians were interned. 7,000 people of Italian birth were living in North Queensland alone, where they worked on sugarcane or fruit picking. And when Italy entered the war in 1940, Italian Australians, they soon felt the hostility from many local people. They were suspected of spying activities, including secretly using hidden radio transmitters. And so those Italian Australians were interned, and guess what? The production of sugar and fruit went down without enough workers at a time during war when the Australians really needed food. James, why do you think Northern Australia was particularly concerned about people who may have had links to those enemy countries? So where's Northern Australia kind of close to?
Like the Pacifics, countries like Japan is quite close, and where Japan ruled.
Yeah, exactly right. Japan had expanded, it had taken over Indonesia, for example. It was then called the Dutch East Indies, or at least most of Indonesia, which is very close to Northern Australia. So there's this fear in the north of Australia especially that the Japanese are about to invade and that there'll be spies already in Australia ready to help them. And of course, people who had Japanese ancestry were particularly suspected of being spies.
Even some Aboriginal peoples were interned. After Japan entered the war, some white Australians claimed that Aboriginal people in the North Australia would help the Japanese to invade.
Yes, and this is just one story. There was a Christian pastor called George who tried to help local Indigenous people near Cooktown in northern Queensland. The problem was that pastor George Schwartz, had been born in Germany, although he'd been living in Australia for over 50 years. George Schwartz and his wife owned a farm where they and some Aboriginal people produced food for the local population, which was mainly Indigenous. Because Pastor Schwartz was from Germany, Australian Army intelligence saw him as a possible security problem, a possible spy. Early in the morning of the 17th of May 1942, the army and local police arrived to arrest Pastor Schwartz and remove the Aboriginal people who lived in his area. They removed 254 Indigenous people who were sent south under guard to places they found cold and unhealthy. Tragically, by March 1943, 60 of those Indigenous people had lost their lives. Another sad chapter of history.
What kind of star would go to jail?
I think a celebrity. No? Not go to a jail cell. Okay. What kind of star would go to jail?
A shooting star. So, did Germany do the same thing, imprisoning ordinary people from the enemy countries?
Yes, and sometimes worse. The Nazis imprisoned civilians who were born in their enemies' countries, like if they were born in the US and Britain and they lived in Germany, then yeah, they were interned or imprisoned. But unlike internees in the USA or Britain, many of these prisoners were forced to work as slave labour, as were people in countries Germany invaded, like France and Netherlands.
The one part of the British Isle that Germany invaded was the Channel Islands, located near France. In 1942, the Germans sent 2,000 British civilians from the Channel Isles to an internment camp in Germany.
Yeah, and in 1941-2, approximately 130,000 civilians from Allied countries living and working in colonies. So this is mainly in Southeast Asia or South Asia, countries that have been part of the British Empire or the Dutch Empire, like India, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya. These 130,000 civilians were taken captive by the Japanese, including men, women and children. The camps varied in size, and I know well one of these camps. It had people from Britain, the US, Canada, Australia, Netherlands and one or two other countries. Do you know where that camp was, James?
Wasn't it in Stanley, Hong Kong?
That's right. The Stanley internment camp was on Hong Kong Island, and it held up to 3,000 people, and most of its buildings are still there today. Some of the buildings of Stanley Camp were a school before the war, St. Stephen's, and they are a school, St. Stephen's, again now. It was just interrupted by the war when they were used to imprison civilian internees. I've known several people who were captives in that camp. In camps controlled by Imperial Japanese forces like Stanley, brutality from the guards was common. For example, if you didn't bow down deeply enough when a Japanese guard walked by you, you would probably get at least a rifle butt whacked into your face. And the food in the camps was small and terrible, so there was very little of it, and what you did get didn't taste great. And so obviously people were unhealthy and death rates were high. Imperial Japan deliberately starved people, and even though Red Cross charity parcels with medicines inside were sent to Stanley Camp and with extra food in some of those parcels, the guards did not let those supplies get to the prisoners. They just took them for themselves. Must say there was one Japanese guard, a Christian minister called Kiyoshi Watanabe, who took a very different line. He risked his life by secretly supplying small quantities of some medicines to some of the internees. If his bosses in the Imperial Japanese Army had found out, he would have been court-martialed and probably killed.
Could the people interned in Hong Kong tell their families back home they were there?
Yeah, so families back home would want to know if their relatives were dead or alive. After the big battle of Hong Kong, nobody knew. Back home in Britain, Australia, Canada, India as well. Then there were regiments that fought in the battle from Canada, UK and India. And of course civilians from those countries were in Hong Kong as well. So no, the Imperial Japanese won the battle, defeated the British side, and then would not let anybody send out any communications from the camps. So the camp guards stopped any letters going out, or coming in for that matter. So those anxious relatives back in Britain or Australia, etc., they just didn't know if their loved ones were dead or imprisoned.
Were there many escaped from Stanley Camp?
A handful, and one person who tried to escape from Stanley internment camp was unusual, because she was the only woman to do so, and she was the only female we know of to escape from any Japanese internment camp during World War II. Certainly any Western woman. This time, the 1940s, was a period when women were not allowed to work in most types of jobs, and were not expected to do sport or take initiative. Women were there to be protected by men. But this 25-year-old Englishwoman called Gwen Priestwood was not the sort to sit and wait for men to finish fighting the war and come and save her. 3 years before the war would end, Gwen, together with a former Hong Kong policeman, escaped from the camp at night. They eventually made it off Hong Kong Island, and after many adventures travelling through 800 miles of land in China that was occupied by Imperial Japanese forces, Gwen made it to freedom. Once back in London, she was able to give the British government a detailed list of everyone who was in the camp. She'd smuggled that list out with her, and she gave a detailed report about how awful the conditions were. I've been through the archives and I've read Gwen's reports, and so did the top people in the UK government. Some of Gwen's reports were actually read out in Parliament by the British Foreign Secretary. So during the war, that was like the number 2. Anthony Eden was number 2, really, to Sir Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister. It helped the British and their allies to understand more about their enemy.
Gwen's story is what Dad's second wartime novel, The Slightest Chance, is based on. See paulletters.com if you want to see more info. What is the prisoner's favourite punctuation?
I don't know. What is a prisoner's favourite punctuation?
A full stop.
Why?
Because it makes the end of the sentence.
At the end of the prison sentence. So, we've been looking at internment in different countries during World War II and asking why ordinary families were imprisoned. Do you think it would? I mean, I suppose the answer to that you said earlier, James, right at the very beginning, they were suspected of being spies. Do you think it was kind of worth it?
There could have been 1 or 2 people, but I think it wasn't worth it because they'd probably find out. Well, it wouldn't have made such a big difference.
They interned hundreds of thousands of people. Now, there may possibly have been 1 or 2 spies in that lot. But imagine, out of that hundreds of thousands of people, you could have had hundreds of thousands of people helping in the war effort for America, Britain and Australia. That's people who could have been soldiers, etc., going to war, but also others who could have been working in factories, producing tanks and guns and bombs and also growing food, of course, all things that people needed during the war. So that's about it for today.
Please share our podcast on social media and rate and review us on Apple Podcast or wherever you listen to our podcasts. Bye from now.
From Dad
and me,
love history.
Dad and me love a whole lot of history. We could be the greatest team that the world has ever seen. Dad and me love a whole lot of history. And now we go to an advert break for parents.
The Slightest Chance is my latest World War II thriller love story based around real history. After the Japanese won the Battle of Hong Kong, a young English woman named Gwen, who was a real person, was the only female to escape from a Japanese camp, and she did so on foot, and then faced an 800-mile journey across occupied China. By the end of this novel, you will have learned all about her extraordinary adventure and how Gwen was secretly carrying information which the very top of the British government would use in the fight against Imperial Japan. Also from real history, included in the novel is the mass breakout led by a one-legged Chinese admiral, and then there's the Japanese guard, Kiyoshi Watanabe, whose Christian faith pushed him to risk his life helping Japan's enemies. Find out more at paulletters.com. The Slightest Chance, when your enemy is your best friend.
Dad's new novel is now available to order online at all the usual places or order it directly from the publisher Blacksmith Books. Books. For details, go to paulletters.com or click on the link from dadandmelovehistory.com.
Here are some questions to see how well you understood today's episode.
Number 1. What does internment mean?
Number 2. When did Japanese Americans receive an apology for being interned by the US government? Number 3. From which South American countries did the USA take people captive if they had Japanese ancestry?
Number 4. And the final question. Do you think internment, whether by Americans, British, Australians, Germany or Japan, was fair?
Oh, that's a difficult question to finish with. Okay, break time. A prisoner was released from jail after many years. Once outside, he shouted, "Yay, I'm free! I'm free!" A little boy heard him and yelled back, "So what? I'm 5! I'm 5!"
Ha ha ha!
I think James loved all my jokes the best. Testing, 1, 2, 3. Say something. Like you're going to say it so we can see if we're at the same levels.
Hello.
Is it me you're looking for? Okay, so we need to lean in. I know I need to lean to about there.
Hello? Is that loud enough?
Yeah.
Hello? No.
Somewhere in between, yeah.
Hello?
Okay. And to quote Lionel Richie, "Hello, everyone.
And welcome to
Dad
and me
Love
History. Oh, your jokes.
Yeah. So I do mine. Do you want to do yours first, actually, in case we've got any overlaps?
Why did the picture go to jail?
I don't know. Why did the picture go to jail?
Because it was framed.
I've got some jokes now, so don't look at the screen because the answers are right next to them. Why did the picture go to jail?
Because it was framed.
Yes. What do prisoners use to call each other?
I don't know. What do prisoners say to call each other?
Well, what prisoners use to call each other is cell phones.
Ha 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 ha!